At school, I was beginning to wonder about being friends with Hugh. We'd been going into Anlaby on a lunchtime and having a laugh and all of that. But then I noticed he'd started shoplifting. Best of it wasn't even stuff either of us needed. It was stuff like cochineal, licorice imps, or imperial leather. I mean, I didn't even know what cochineal was, other than if you got it on your clothes, it made a horrible stain. Neither of us could stand licorice imps, and as for imperial leather, well, Hugh obviously had no use for soap, and we always had Lux, Knight's Castile or Lifebuoy at home anyway, so I couldn't sneak it into ours. And apart from anything else, it meant I had to wait until I was grown up to discover the wonders of the everlasting label. Course, it didn't take long before he got caught. We'd gone into the usual place, and I reckon the guy behind the counter must have cottoned on to us. 'Cause what happened was, Hugh tried to steal some Mr. Ben's rice, and then guess what? As if by magic, the shopkeeper appeared. He invited us to come into his back room, so we made a run for it, which I know was wrong, but I didn't want to go into his back room, and in some ways I'm glad I didn't, especially since I've seen what some of the people in that film, Pulp Fiction, changed into when they went into a shop's back room. Put me off Ann Summers' parties as well. More rabbit than Sainsbury's or not. The guy was shouting after us, saying he was going to ring the school. So we decided we'd have to play Twag and go back to Hugh's for the afternoon. He reckoned his mam would be out at Eileen's hairdresser's, a salon called Are You Having a Lot Off? And his dad was never around during the day anyway. Hugh didn't speak about his dad much, but from what I could make out, he said his dad supplied the rubber for something called prophylactics. Either way, he must have been doing all right, 'cause they had a massive house on Plantation Drive. I'd been to Hugh's house once before for tea, and although it was lovely, I'd ended up feeling a bit weird around his mam. She'd spent most of the time on a sunbed upstairs. But then when she did come down, she was in a lightweight robe, smoking a matching Sobrani, and for some reason, she insisted on showing me her new bathroom suite. Hugh said to leave me alone, and that neither of us was interested in any bathroom suite, which was definitely true of him, what with his hygiene problem and all of that. I mean, he lived in such a lovely house, I couldn't understand why he didn't get a bath. But then I couldn't understand why he was shoplifting either. If anything, I would have thought that's going to make you sweat even more. Anyway, I went upstairs with her just to be polite. And then she started saying stuff like, I get a shower every day, touch wood. Do you ever touch wood? I like touching wood. I think it's a source of comfort, don't you? Like I say, I felt a bit weird. But she was all smiles and wiggling about a lot as we went into the bathroom. Nice carpet, don't you reckon? Shag. What do you think of shag in the bathroom? Well, I didn't know where to put myself, and I said, I suppose it's as good a place as any, but wouldn't it get wet? And she said, I should hope so. That's the whole point of having it in here. Wet and soft to the touch. Then she says, what do you think of the fittings? Silver, much classier than gold. I don't like gold in showers, not to my taste at all. All a bit tacky if you ask me. Then she starts asking me about what the basin next to the toilet is, which is when Hugh came rushing up from behind and says, it's a bidet, mum, he knows that, before turning to me and saying, she's got that 'cause she talks out of her backside, and most of what comes out is crap. I was quite shocked, and I couldn't imagine saying something like that about my mam, let alone in front of one of me mates. You'd end up getting your mouth washed out with soap. But then, like I say, Hugh was very good at avoiding soap. Not that it stopped her though. Next thing I know, we're having tea off a hostess trolley. And she's saying, "Would you like crumpet?" By this time I was getting even more embarrassed. But it turns out she actually meant a pikelet, which I suppose could be even more confusing as well. If you think about it. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that pikelets were baby fish. So maybe crumpet is a better word. After that, she starts going on about gatto. And I'm thinking, what's an Elvis Presley song got to do with anything? But it turns out she meant cake. It's weird, isn't it? I mean, all the time I've listened to that song and I thought Elvis was singing about crime and social problems. But it turns out he's singing about cake, which he probably knew more about anyway. Let's face it. Anyway, I ended up settling for a bit of crumpet and a lady finger, which although it was very nice, was nowhere near enough to fill a hole. When I got home, I told Mam all about it. And Mam said, well, if that's who I think it is, she was like that at school as well. Hostess trolley. She was always putting it about. That's a strange thing to do in a school, isn't it? Pushing a hostess trolley around. That's another great thing about Tupperware. It's much more convenient when it comes to putting the stuff in that you've made in domestic science. I mean, who wants to take a hostess trolley to school? And with that, Tez, who was making a rare visit, popped out to get us all patty peas and chips, but not before reckoning that he could get some work out of a mate of his called Timmy, who had a window cleaning round that included Plantation Drive. According to Tez, there were no end of women willing to fill the bucket. Later on, I told Les all about it as well, as he was walking me back from Mayfield Street. And he said sometimes people say these things unintentionally, before going on to give me a really big explanation about something he called a Freudian slip. It sounded really interesting, but I must admit I'd forgotten most of it by the time we reached Ainlby Road. So we got back to Hugh's after the shoplifting episode, and he stuck on some music whilst I set up the TV for a game of Pong. He had a big record collection, did Hugh, so he put on an album called Frampton Comes Alive, which I'd never heard of before. It sounded more like Trumpton Comes Alive to me. You know, the bit where the fire brigade turn into a band. Pew, pew, Barney McGrew, Cuthbert Dibble Grub. From what I could make out, Peter Frampton was looking to find his way, 'cause there were tracks on there called Show Me the Way and then Baby I Love Your Way. I later found out from Les that he'd lost his way completely until his old schoolmate David Bowie helped him find it again, 'cause he never let him down. They made an album together, which as coincidence would have it, was a bit of a letdown. Maybe the title was meant to be sarcastic or something. Hugh had a really flashy stereo system as well, whilst we only had a radiogram at ours. Either way, you didn't need a remote back then, 'cause the great thing about playing Pong while listening to music was that when the record stopped, you could get up from your game and change it, in between taking your turn. You had ages. You even had long enough to rifle through the record selector. It was whilst I was changing the record, I suddenly caught sight of a CB radio set up in the corner. I hadn't noticed it before. Well, it turned out that his dad was Big Rubber Johnny, and typical Hugh showing off. He reckoned his dad was the first person in Hull to get one. CB radio, that is. So I said, if your dad was the first person in Hull to get a CB radio set. Who did he talk to then? I mean, even if you've only got 2 cans and a bit of string, you're still going to need someone to listen at the other end, aren't you? After a while, Hugh decided it would be a good idea if we had some home brew, and 'cause I'd never really had anything to drink before, I said yes. Hugh said his dad was complaining about it being too watery, but he reckoned he was doing his dad a favour by stopping him from developing a problem. Very generous when you think he was also putting himself at risk in the process. So we were having a bit of watery home brew when Hugh asked me if I'd like to see his dad's porn mag. Nowadays, porn is everywhere and much easier to come by. But back then, the nearest I'd got was finding bits of porn mags on bomb buildings with me mates. A lot of it was in a foreign language as well. I had no idea how it got there, but Mam reckoned that the Germans used to drop poisonous sweets on us during the war to kill the kids, so maybe the sweets were wrapped up in bits of porn mag. If the sweets didn't kill you, I suppose the porn would mess with your head. Anyway, the nearest I'd really got to looking at scantily clad women was in me Mam's Marshall Ward catalogue, but even then they still had the bras and pants on. You didn't get to look for very long anyway, 'cause you had to put all your effort into keeping the catalogue open in the first place. Like I say, nowadays, what with porn being available at the click of a button, it's much easier to come by. So I had a look at his dad's porn mag. What there was were loads of pictures taken on a film set of a woman and a load of blokes dressed up as soldiers. The pages had titles like Your Mum in Half Hot, Army Dads, and Are You Being Serviced? And at the end, it had a bit called You've Been Looking At, where it gave the names of all of the people involved, such as Mrs. Slocum, Mr. Humphrey, and Captain Peacock. Those series were never the same after that for me. But the bit I especially remember was a section called Readers' Wives. Pictures of women taken at home with what looked like the same faulty camera, as they all had black lines across their eyes. Maybe they were like that Cyclops bloke and had powerful beams of energy coming from their eyes and had to control them. Either way, it was odd that was the only thing that had ended up getting covered up. I mean, if you're half naked and somebody walks in, you don't think, quick, I better cover me eyes. Least I wouldn't. Out of all the pictures though, one stood out straight away, 'cause it looked exactly like Hugh's mam, right down to the silver taps in the new bathroom suite. I couldn't understand why Hugh hadn't spotted it, but then he didn't use the bathroom, so maybe that was it. I'd already started to feel unwell, 'cause not only had we had home brew, we'd also had a lot of drinks out of his mam's cabinet as well, like Warninks, Advocar, Babysham and Campari, as well as a couple of Sobrani each. We didn't go as far as wearing her robe, but the picture in his dad's magazine had made me feel really odd, so I thought I better beat it. The bus ride home was terrible. I got on, and it wasn't long before I started to feel like I was going to throw up. I managed to hold back until I got as far as Carnegie Library in West Park, and then I had to jump off one stop from home. Before you knew it, I was vomiting everywhere. But it wasn't all that embarrassing, 'cause Hull Fair was on, and seeing kids retching all over the place was a common enough sight. It made me nervous about getting on buses drunk though, and to this day I still think of that route as the 63 Seasick. I was glad when they changed it to the number 2, although that could remind you of getting caught short as well, especially from the point of view of Auntie Didlum. The next day at school, I was expecting us to get found out, and I was worried sick about what would happen. But all that did happen was the head mentioned it in assembly, saying that there'd been reports of a couple of students shoplifting in Ainleby, and to mark his words, he'd get to the bottom of it. It's a good job they didn't have electronic registers in those days. Otherwise, we'd have ended up knowing what was meant by getting to the bottom of it as well.